Good evening, everybody. With this 22nd edition of Schools Out. And tonight we have as a speaker Alison Killing. But first I would like to explain to you a little bit about the program, the other program that we have the coming months at the school. The other Schools Out events and 3 workshops that we are organizing. First of all, the other Schools Out events. Next month in February we'll have Studio Ossidiana with Alessandra Covini and Giovanni Bellotti. In March we'll have Samir Bantal, who's the director of AMO at OMA. In April we'll have Verity Jane Keefe, an artist working in London on post-war estates. In May we'll have BC Architects, a collective from Brussels, followed by a workshop the next day on building with loam and clay. And yeah, be sure to get your tickets on time. Also for the next, for Studio Ossidiana, because they seem to have a large fan base in Rotterdam and their tickets are almost half sold out. So don't forget to get your ticket. And then in June, the last Then we have 3 workshops that you can still be part of. Starting the second half of February, then we'll have the workshop Living in the Super Diverse City, which will be a sociological approach to super diversity in Afrikanerwijk, a part of Rotterdam South. And we'll do that together with Arnold Rijndorp, the urban sociologist, and with artist Neeltje de Westend. The first week of March we'll have the workshop that we do together with ZUS, Christian Koreman and Elma Verboksel, which will be on the topic of crime and control in the public realm and the role of if you can make the time to follow one of these workshops, or all 3 of them, of course, you're welcome. But now first, I'd like to introduce Alison Killing to you. Alison is a British architect, urban designer and geospatial analyst. She was trained in the UK, but she came to Rotterdam, and in 2010 she started her office with a marvelous, I know it's a coincidence, but it's the greatest name that you could ever have for an architect's office, Killing Architects. And also last year, 2021, Alison was rewarded the prestigious Pulitzer Prize, a journalism prize. And it's the first time that an architect ever won this prize. And she won it with a team in the category of international reporting, on the subject of the exposure of secret Chinese state camps in the Xinjiang region, the most western province of China. So this all has to do with the imprisonment of Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other Muslim minorities in that part of China. And how she identified, I'm not even sure if I'm saying everything correct, but you will correct me if I'm wrong, and how Alison was able to do this, she will talk about tonight. Of course, I feel that I don't have to explain why this is so relevant and urgent. It's every day on the news. But of course, in a case like this, when everybody knows there's a huge violation of human rights, you don't feel that as an architect or as a designer or as a historian or whatever, you can really contribute to a solution or improvement of these conditions. But I feel that it's very special that Alison has found a way to be relevant in such a situation. So I'm really happy that you're here, Alison, or here, virtually here. And I would like to give the floor to you for a presentation on how, an explanation on how you did this work. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invite and for having me. Just share my screen. So yeah, as Michelle said, I'm an architect. I studied architecture, graduated. I worked in commercial practice for a number of years, and now I work mostly with investigative journalists, and I increasingly describe my work as journalism, although it's very much rooted in architectural practice. So for the past 3 years or so, I've been working on the issue of Xinjiang, where it's estimated that over 1 million people have been detained arbitrarily. Xinjiang this is where Xinjiang is. It's in northwest China. It's an autonomous region. And it's home to a number of indigenous people who are Turkic Muslims. So the Uyghur are the largest group, but there are also Kazakhs and Uzbeks, Turkish, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Hui Muslims, Shibe, and Mongolians, amongst others. Xinjiang, it's only fairly recently become part of China. It was integrated into China under the Qing Empire in about 250 years ago. And even then, it was only quite loosely controlled. It's then had a couple of periods of independence. The most recent one was in the late 1940s. And it's very important to China for a few reasons. One is that it has a large number of natural resources. It has oil, it has cotton. It's also a major farming region and produces a lot of the world's tomatoes. And it's also in a geopolitically very important location. It's surrounded by 8 other countries in Central Asia, and it's in a key position on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to connect China over land and over sea to Europe and to the rest of Asia. So Xinjiang gives important access to the ports in Pakistan, for example. So that sort of those things kind of start to explain why this campaign of oppression has been happening. There's this group of people there who are distinct from the majority ethnic group, the Han. They have this history of independence. They have a lot of resources, and it's in a geopolitically important position. Although, of course, nothing can actually justify what is happening in Xinjiang at the moment. So over the past 10 years, we've seen this increase in oppression in Xinjiang. This is a photograph of Kashgar, which was taken in summer 2017. Now, Xinjiang has always had a slightly, and the Turkic Muslims living there have for a very long time had quite a difficult relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Since Xinjiang was integrated into the PRC in 1949, there's been a lot of discrimination on the grounds of discrimination in employment and in education. There's also been a lot of crackdowns on religion, sort of intermittent crackdowns on the practice of Islam. And so over the past sort of 10 years, that oppression has got quite significantly worse. So the first things that we saw was this massive increase in the amount of surveillance that was present in Xinjiang. As we can see in this photograph, there's a number of CCTV cameras right down this street, which is in Kashgar. But more than that, there would be roadblocks set up right through the city centre. There would be roadblocks maybe even every 200 or 300 meters at key crossroads and key entrances to the old city. And people, to pass through those, they would have to pass through a metal detector. They might have to show ID. They might have to get their iris scanned. They might have to get their phone scanned to check whether they had any software on it that the Chinese Communist Party didn't approve of. That was very sort of oppressive and very intimidating in itself, but it was also just very, very impractical in terms of like wanting to go out and do your grocery shopping and having to pass through several checkpoints on the way there, or, you know, just wanting to fill up your car with petrol and having to go through all of these security checks in order to be able to do so. So that made normal life very, very difficult. And then in 2016, this campaign sort of took a more serious turn again. And what we saw was the introduction of a detention program and the building of camps. In August 2016, Chen Changguo, who had been the head of the Communist Party in Tibet and who had overseen a campaign of oppression there, he became the Communist Party boss in Xinjiang. And very quickly, we started to see the growth of these camps. Now, in the beginning, they were like the facility that we can see here in the sort of top half of this screen, in the top half of this image. And they were sort of fairly large compounds which the government had easy access to. So they would be existing schools or hospitals. They might also be apartment complexes which had not been sold and which were sitting empty, and which would then be taken over, and over the course of a matter of days or even weeks, they would be converted into camps. And we would see that they would have security features added, like fencing around them. On the inside, we would see that, you know, like barred doors were added throughout to create cells. CCTV and other security measures were added. And then from about 2018 onwards, or from late 2017 onwards, we saw that this campaign suddenly became even more serious. And we saw that what was starting to happen was that these new, much larger, much higher security and purpose-built camps were starting to be constructed. And that's an example of one is in the bottom half of this screen here. So the way that I became involved in this was through meeting an American journalist, Megha Rajagopalan, at a workshop in summer of 2018. Now, Megha she had been working in China for a long time. She had been a political correspondent for Reuters, and then she had moved to BuzzFeed to be the China bureau chief. And she'd also worked a lot on Xinjiang. So in sort of early 2017, rumors were starting to come out that hundreds of thousands of people had been disappeared into these camps in Xinjiang. And so Megha became interested in this and wanted to try and find one of them. And there's a big diaspora population that live in Almaty in Kazakhstan. And she spoke with some of them, and one of them was able to point out to her on Google Maps where they thought one of these camps were. That was in Kashgar. And so she went to Kashgar to try and find it. And she was the first journalist to actually visit one of these camps. Shortly afterwards, her China visa came up for renewal, and the Chinese government declined to renew it. And so she had to leave China. And shortly after that happened, we met. So Megha was still very keen to keep working on this topic and to try and find the rest of these camps. She had thought that satellite imagery might be a good way to do that. That was, after all, the technique that she had found, that she had used to find the first one of these camps. And then we got talking and realized that we maybe had a complementary skill set, that I was interested in this topic. I had done a fair amount of like cartography and mapping work. I had done a fair amount of satellite imagery work. And so I might be able to help with this. And so after this workshop, we kind of kept in touch. And over the course of the next couple of months, we started to look into different techniques that we might use to try and find these camps. So satellite imagery was a really good place to start, we thought, for a few reasons. The first of which is that it's very, very difficult to work in Xinjiang. Mega had lost her visa, which made it very difficult for her to go there to get another visa and be able to go again. But even for journalists who did, in theory, have access, it was very, very difficult to work there. It was mainly because of harassment by the authorities. So people would get followed, they would get detained, which was obviously intimidatory, but it also consumes your time and resources. And what they would also do is intimidate anyone who spoke to a journalist. And of course, the threat was that these people could then be sent to camps. So it was very difficult to work in Xinjiang effectively, and it was even harder to do so ethically. So we needed to find a different way to do it. Xinjiang is also absolutely huge. It's about 4 times the size of Germany. So even just to cover that area and to try and find this network of camps which are spread across the region is extraordinarily difficult. And so again, we needed another technique. And the final thing that was good about satellite imagery is that it's a source of information that the Chinese government can't control. They harass journalists and make it very difficult to report, but they also censor the internet and censor social media very heavily. And so that's one of the reasons that very little information had emerged at that point. When we started working on this, it was believed that there were 1,200 camps in existence, and it was believed that 1 million people were detained. And yet the international community lacked good information, and they lacked evidence of what was happening. And so that was what we wanted to provide. We wanted to try and find all of the camps and provide that evidence. So we looked into a few different techniques that we could use. We thought about trying to use machine learning and quickly rejected that because the camps they seem too complex to for that to be a viable strategy. And then one day I was reading an article in Wired about Baidu Total View, which is the Chinese version of Google Street View. And in that article, I read about how these industrial estates in the east of China were being photoshopped clumsily out of this street level imagery. And I sort of saw these images, and it was really odd and really clumsy, that somebody had taken like the clone tool in Photoshop and sort of scrubbed across where these industrial chimneys were. And you could still see the streaks of the chimneys behind. So it was very obvious that the image had been tampered with. But nevertheless, it appeared to be some sort of attempt at censorship. And so it occurred to me that if Baidu was censoring industrial estates in the east of China, that they would probably be censoring camps in Xinjiang as well. And so I went to have a look for that. Now, there were a number of locations that we knew definitely were camps because journalists had been to visit them. There were about 6 or so. And so I went to look at those locations in Baidu. And I found that actually that there was no street level imagery in those locations, but instead I found myself looking at the satellite imagery, and as I zoomed in, this strange thing happened, that at a certain point, this white square, light grey square appeared over the location of the camp. And I zoomed in further, and it quickly disappeared, and the satellite imagery disappeared because there, at the time at least, there was no high resolution satellite imagery of Xinjiang in Baidu. And so that all disappeared just to be replaced by the reference map tiles of the region. The reference map is like the grey tiles that you'll see in Google Maps or Apple Maps, where a road is just a single line and a building is just drawn in outline. These really simple, basic maps. And so I was kind of it was a little bit strange what had happened, but it also just looked a little bit like maybe the internet was slow, maybe it just hadn't loaded or something like that. And so I zoomed out again and zoomed in, and the same thing happened. And after I'd done this 2 or 3 times and realized that I could replicate it, I realized that it couldn't, in fact, be a problem with the map loading, because all of the tiles ought to have been in the browser's cache. And in fact, something different was going on. And so I went to look at the other locations where we knew there were camps. And I found the same thing happening there with these grey tiles. And at that point, I realized that we had a technique that we might be able to use to find the rest of the camp network. And of course, we could look at the censored location in Baidu and then go and look at the same location in an uncensored satellite image, such as in Google Earth, and we could see what was there. So at that point, we asked Christo Bushek to join us. He's a developer with a huge amount of human rights experience. He's done a lot of work to archive and collate data on human rights. He worked with the Syrian Archive, for example, which has attempted to archive all of the YouTube videos that were made of the Syrian conflict. So he has a lot of experience in sort of gathering this digital data, and also in building the tools that would allow researchers to analyze it effectively. So we began working with him, and he made a map of all of the locations across Xinjiang where these mask tiles were. And we'd expected that there would maybe be 500,000 of them. But instead, we actually found that there were 5 million locations which had been censored. So there were 5 million of them. And it wasn't just camps that were censored, it was all sorts of other facilities which had some sort of strategic value for the Chinese government. So military bases were in there, and sort of army training grounds, but also wind farms and solar farms, electricity substations and industrial estates, and then of course prisons and the camps. So we had way too many of these mask tile locations to actually sort through. And we needed to find a way to narrow that down. And the way that we ended up doing that was to start to say, well, we know that there are a number of things that these camps need in order to exist. The first thing is to have them constructed, you need to get machinery there and building materials, and you need to get workers there. So they must be close to pretty decent infrastructure, to quite good roads. And then the other things that they need in order to run, they need gas and electricity and water and internet. And the easiest way for them to get those things is to connect to an existing grid, probably near to an existing town or other infrastructure, rather than, it wouldn't be that easy to dig a channel 300 miles out into the desert to bring water and internet to this camp. So they're probably near towns where they can access those services directly. And then of course the plan was to fill these places with detainees. They also need to come from somewhere. So again, it makes sense to be near a town. There would need to be guards to work there and other staff. They need somewhere to live. They're likely to have families. They would have children who need to go to school. So again, all of these things suggested that these places were probably near to towns. And so that's how we narrowed down our search. We narrowed it down to a buffer area around urban centres and along major infrastructure. And that took us down to a much more manageable number of locations that we needed to search. It was about 50,000 by that point. And at that point, I started to work through them systematically. So I started with Kashgar, which is in the southwest of Xinjiang, and it's the Uyghur heartland. We knew that there were a large number of camps there, and I just started to work through the mask tile locations systematically. I did about 10,000 in that first week. And having done that, we realized more things about the camps. So we found quite a lot of these places which looked very, very suspicious and very, very likely to be camps. And having done that, we knew sort of what they looked like and the range of different appearances that they might have. And we'd also learned a lot about where they tended to be. So as we had expected, they were on the outskirts of cities. In fact, they were often in industrial estates, because not only do you have like access to services, but you also have large amounts of land there. So you have like large service plots, which was perfect for what was needed. So yeah, and in that way, we were able to find what we believe to be the full network, which is, we found 348 locations, and that's, in each location, there might be multiple facilities. So there might be a camp and a detention center and a sort of high security prison. Right, and what I'll do now is to just share my screen again, and I'll show you a couple of these places in more detail. So this is Kashgar, which is down in the southwest of Xinjiang. And this place that I'm showing you now, it was really typical of the first phase of camps, when these makeshift camps were being built in schools and hospitals. So this entire compound, if I just go back in time a little bit, so all of this compound, which you can see in construction here, this became a camp. It was actually built as the number 4, 5, and 6 middle school for Kashgar, although it's not clear that it ever served as a school. So yeah, it was built by sort of late summer, early autumn 2017. This place was in use as a camp, and I can just show you some of the features. So we can see here that there's a fence that goes all the way around. That's not so conclusive in this case, because it would be very common for a school to have a fence around it. So this isn't the sort of high level of barricading that we saw in other places, but there were other signs. So something that we often saw with camps was that these sort of informal car parks would spring up on roads and on wasteland nearby. And as a school, probably, if this was functioning as a school, probably the cars would be somewhere on the site. But in a detention facility, that's a security risk. So the cars had to be moved outside of the site. And because this place wasn't planned for a prison, there wasn't a car park that was planned in that way. And so we would start to see these like long lines of cars down nearby roads, as we can see here. Now, fast forwarding a bit, and they started to build on the place where the sports field had been in this school. We were very, very lucky in a lot of Xinjiang that there was that we had a lot of satellite imagery that was high resolution, that it was free to access. We're looking at Google Earth Pro right now, which is a free program which gives public access to all of this like high resolution satellite imagery. And we had images sort of, every few weeks in some parts of Kashgar, which really allowed us to look very closely at the progress of building and really to sort of see what was happening in these camps. So what we can see is that by August 2018, this new set of buildings had been finished. And now we could see a few more things that were really characteristic of camps. So having a lot of satellite imagery was also really good because it can vary in quality based on the atmospheric conditions on the day that it's taken. And also satellites will often take images from slightly different angles, and those different angles would allow us to see different things. So in this image here, we can see a couple of things which are really interesting. The first is these blue sheds, which appeared alongside the buildings. These blue roof buildings, they were like a key giveaway that a place had been converted to a camp. They were often, well, they're steel framed buildings with metal roofs. and they had like quite large spans. And in some cases, for example, where the compound had been apartment buildings, these large like metal sheds would give space for like uses which need bigger rooms, like classrooms or canteens or kitchens, things like that. In other places, we would see them wedged in between existing buildings, and they would become factories, or they had been built on the school sports field. And there's really no reason why a school would be putting these metal frame buildings on a sports field. So it was a key sign that it was a camp. Another thing that we can see in this image is these barbed wire fences, which actually surround each of these buildings and cut it off from the rest of the compound. And then along the northern facade of each of these, we can see that there's these like further like barbed wire like pens, and those were exercise yards for the detainees. And then just going forwards again, there's another image that I'd like to show you. Yes, like often we would, especially when we had a lot of imagery, we might get lucky and sort of start to see specific like time-bound things that were happening. So in this case, we can see that there were buses apparently arriving on the site. Now they might be bringing detainees to the compound, to the camp. They might also be picking people up to take them to work at a factory nearby. And there was a lot of forced labor in this camp system. And the other thing that we can see in this image, which is interesting, is that we can see what appears to be people in this courtyard. So all wearing like red uniforms and lined up in these really tight military formations. And again, that was something that we came to view as being indicative that a place was a camp. So this next place that I'm going to show you is in Dabancheng. It's not far from Urumqi, which is the regional capital, and it's this camp here is much more typical of this later phase of camps when they got much higher security, purpose built, and also built to last. So just looking at the satellite imagery, there was nothing here in 2015. And it was only in, like, I think early March in 2018 that we started to see evidence of building on this site. And then already by April, like we had the sort of bare bones of this first compound. This was finished in July. And then by October 2018, all of this had been built. So there's absolutely huge compound. So just to sort of show you what I can see here. I mean, here we've got a dedicated car park built from the outset. On this side, we've got sort of guard and admin facilities for the camp. These buildings look like apartment buildings, probably for the staff to live in. And then in the main prison compound, this is the entrance building. There's only one entrance to this compound, very heavily guarded. I think it must be incredibly intimidating to arrive at this place. Then we can see that there's this really thick concrete perimeter wall. It's 1.5 to 2 meters thick. It's 7 to 8 meters high. We can judge the height by measuring the shadows and then calculating the height based on the angle of the sun at the day and time that the image was taken. In the corners, there's guard towers and also key points along the wall. And then over here in this part of the compound, we can see these blue roofed buildings, and we believe that those are factories. We've seen some of them under construction in other places, so we know that they're steel framed buildings, and factories right across Xinjiang look very similar. Steel framed, and then they have like powder coated blue or red roofs. So they're also like very easy to spot. And so, yeah, like so just to sort of explain also what the Chinese government has been saying about these places, right through 2017, they were denying that these places existed at all. And it was only really it was only a year later when there had been like a whole series of reports by journalists who had, been to visit camps, had spoken with ex-detainees, that the weight of evidence was becoming quite difficult to ignore, that the Chinese government insisted, like, okay, well, yes, there are camps, but, then they're actually for re-education and they're for training. There's a number of reasons that we don't believe that to be true. Firstly, like this entire program was highly coercive. So people would be arrested, they would be blindfolded and handcuffed and brought to these places. They often weren't told why, and would find out, maybe several months later, that what they had done was to download WhatsApp, that they had a family member abroad, perhaps they themselves had traveled abroad. Perhaps they showed outward signs of religious practice. So for a man, that might be growing a beard. For a woman, she might wear a headscarf. None of which, by the way, are crimes in China. There were also in some places quotas for the authorities to round people up and bring them to the camps. So, and this is corroborated by leaked documents, which explained why people had been detained. So, on that basis, we don't believe that these really are training camps. Many of the people who were detained as well, especially initially, were the real pillars of the community in Xinjiang. They were successful business people, they were academics, and intellectuals, and also religious leaders. And these people were targeted from the beginning. Many of them already spoke fluent Chinese, or fluent Mandarin Chinese rather, and so had absolutely no need of Chinese language lessons and training in how to do basic factory work, because that's the main justification that the Chinese government was giving at the time, that people needed training so that they would be able to take better paid jobs, but for example in factories. There's also the issue of all of the mistreatment that people suffered in these places, which also suggests that they were not a benign training program. And so that was the official story sort of from 2018. And then in 2019, in December, the governor of Xinjiang announced that all of the camps had closed. And yet, as he was announcing that, we had satellite imagery that showed that almost certainly wasn't the case. And there were a whole series of large high security camps that were opening just at that point, including this one, which was finished end of 2019, start of 2020. This one, it's also very high security, with this really thick perimeter wall. We know that it's actually a medium security prison because it has one layer of barbed wire on either side of the perimeter wall, and that's a characteristic of a medium security prison. So we actually also got the Chinese prison building regulations, which explained to us things like that. And so we were able to use those to interpret what we were seeing in the satellite imagery. This building here, which has this sort of barbed wire passageway that leads to the gatehouse, and then another passageway leading to this building. So this is probably where detainees entered the compound and were processed. Right across the compound, we can also see these tall masts, which probably hold lighting and possibly cameras and other surveillance equipment. And then over here, we can also see this is one of the guard buildings. And we know that because it has this walkway that connects it to the top of the perimeter wall. We can see it's an elevated walkway because we can see the shadow and we can see the leg that is supporting it. And this is how the guards would get access to the top of the wall and also to the guard towers. So a lot of our research was done. I should say that this camp in Dabancheng, it's the largest camp that we know of. This first part of the camp, we estimate that it can hold 32,500 people. And we reckon that this smaller one that was opened later, that can hold about 10,000 people. And that's based on figures from the prison building regulations. So I think I should ask Wouter and Michelle, like, we can stop and do questions here, or I can show some more of the project. What would you prefer? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Is it possible for you from the satellite images to say something about the interior of the buildings, how they would look, maybe combined with, did you also look into that? Yes.
Okay, so I'll share this slide then. So yeah, so after we had like found what we think is the full network, and by the way, when we looked at those, we were making judgments about whether we thought a place was a camp or not based on the satellite imagery, but then we were further corroborating it in a number of ways. So sometimes we would be able to find tender documents related to that facility, or we would have media reports, or we would have eyewitness statements. Mega did a huge number of interviews with former detainees, many of whom were able to tell us where they had been held. And that was the case as well for this camp in Mongolkure, Jiaosu, which is it's in the northwest of Xinjiang. And we knew there were actually three detainees who we knew of who had been held here. And so we worked with them and worked on that, and worked to create this model of the camp to look at what these places were like inside and what a day in the life of a detainee was actually like. So the way that we did this, we started off with the satellite imagery, and that gave us the basic layouts of the buildings, the shapes and the sizes. We could also tell how tall the buildings were, either because we would have satellite images which showed the facade, and we were able to then like count the windows and the stories, or because we could look at, we could measure the shadows and work out the height of the building that way. And that gave us a basic model of the camp. We focused in particular on this part of the camp. Sorry. So in early 2000s, the entire camp was just this little detention center. And then in 2017, this area here was added, and that was what we focused on. The rest came later in 2018. So this was the area that we wanted to look at, which was where the 3 former detainees had been held. We got as far as we could using the satellite imagery, and then Mega took the model and went with them, and went and spoke with them and asked them both what they could tell us about what they could see, but we also had a list of questions that we wanted to ask, having got as far as we could just using the satellite imagery. So one of the things that they told us, for example, was about these concrete, these barbed wire pens, which were in the courtyard, and there were 2 of them. And they said that these were the exercise yards that they used. They didn't get to go there very often. They went there maybe once every 6 weeks or so. And there were 2 of them because they were for different categories of detainee and different security categories. So I think almost universally, the people that we've spoken to have been quite low security detainees. And that also made them eligible for release, which meant that we were then able to speak with them and ask them about their experiences. But there were also higher security levels. the men that we spoke to didn't have a lot to do with these people, but they said when they saw them, they would always be handcuffed and shackled, and that they spent a lot of time in that way, that they lived under like really like very harsh conditions, even harsher than those of the people that we spoke to. Another thing that we asked was about the interior layout of this building. So based on the facade and based on what we could see of the roof and where we could see that there were stair access to the roof, we could make a pretty good guess at the layout of this building, that it was a single corridor through the middle with rooms on either side and a couple of cores towards either end. What we didn't know was how big the cells were. Again, we could make a pretty good guess at the structural grid based on the facade, that it was probably an 8-meter structural grid, but we didn't know if a cell was 8 meters wide or only 4. And so Mega went to these detainees and asked them, like, well, the cell that you were in, like, how many windows did it have? And they were able to tell us, well, it was 1. And from there, we knew how many cells there likely were in the building. Similarly, with the classroom, we think that there was only 1 on each floor. And again, the detainees told us that there were 2 windows in that, and suddenly we knew the size. And then from there, they were able to describe in detail what the cell that they were kept in was like. So they were very spare. There were 10 bunk beds in the cell. Based on our calculations and from the Chinese prison building regulations, we estimated that a cell this size ought to only hold 3 or 4 people, but in fact there were 10. We heard repeated, people told us repeatedly about overcrowding in these places, that often there weren't enough beds for people to sleep on, that they had to share, or people had to sleep on the floor. The toilet was in the cell. It was a squat toilet that was in one corner, but there was no privacy for that. And in addition, there was also no privacy because every inch of the cell was covered by CCTV cameras. And those CCTV cameras would be monitored by the guards. There were also microphones in the cells that would pick up what people were saying and what language they were speaking. So people weren't allowed to speak anything other than Mandarin Chinese, although some people, many people spoke a different language as their first language, and some people weren't able to speak Mandarin, in fact. And there was also a loudspeaker in the cell that the guards would shout at people if they broke any of the many rules. During the day, although people sometimes did go to the classroom for some sort of, I hesitate to call it education, because as I said, like, most of these people already spoke Chinese and didn't need Mandarin lessons. But often what people would do would be they were often instructed, in fact, in Communist Party propaganda. So they would spend their time reading Xi Jinping thought. When they couldn't go to the classroom, which was very often because there were just too many people in the camp to actually have people move out of their cells for much of the time, they would stay in the cells. They would be expected to sit on these small plastic stools, sit bolt upright, and to read from their textbooks. And again, if they were slouching, the guards would see it and could shout at them over the loudspeakers. We've heard reports that food was typically very, very poor, and both in quantity and quality. We've heard a lot of reports of beatings and also of torture, that people were often taken and put in solitary confinement. They were often sort of locked into tiger chairs, which are these metal chairs where people's arms and legs can be restrained, and then they would be left there for sort of 24 hours or so. So like very, very poor treatment. But as much as anything, I think a lot of people really suffered from the psychological pressure of being in this place. they very rarely left this room. There was very little stimulation. They very rarely got to go outside or feel fresh air. When they did leave that room, they were expected to follow painted lines in the corridors. So even that was very tightly controlled. And it just led to a huge amount of psychological pressure. And as much as anything on top, when people were released, a really big thing that a lot of people have struggled with is the sense of shame at what happened to them. That this experience that they've had isn't something that they've fully been able to understand or to really come to terms with. Many of them saw themselves as very as sort of good, upstanding citizens, and yet they found themselves being treated like criminals. And this is something that many people have really struggled to come to terms with. Yeah.
Wow.
It's quite a horror story.
Yeah. It's terrifying, this story.
Yeah. No, it is. It's
Alison, do you what comes to mind about the role of architects? Do you, because these prisons, they're not randomly built. It's not just to put up some shacks so do you know anything about, are these built by the state architecture office, or what is the role of your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know who is. I don't know if there are architects involved. There's definitely, we've seen tenders for these places, and they'll often go to big engineering and construction firms to then build these places. And obviously they are very, very obviously and clearly planned. That there's, I mean, it was one of the reasons that we were able to go and get the building regulations and sort of reverse engineer what had been done. And we actually used the building regulations to reverse engineer the capacity of the camps. And we discovered that they'd been built to hold, I think it's 1,014,000 people is the capacity just of the program built since 2016. And that's 1 in 25 of, that's enough to hold 1 in 25 of all the people in Xinjiang, which is just an incredible proportion. We don't necessarily have a lot of insight into the planning. Like I said, the Chinese government controls this information very, 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 very carefully. And they've worked very hard to make it difficult to find out what's happening with the camps. But I mean, for example, we also see evidence of the planning in the distribution of these places across Xinjiang. So in every county, there's a camp and a detention center, and then you get to prefecture level, and there'll be a medium security prison, and a large prefecture will have a high security prison as well. And then the capital will have a whole series of sort of prisons which perhaps serve a regional role. So I mean, there's a huge amount of planning in this.
The planning is very similar to that of other public facilities, the hierarchy of, schools or hospitals, but then...
Yeah.
Did you get any reactions from from the Chinese, and especially from the Chinese architectural community?
No.
Because it seems like the Chinese government has been trying so hard to ignore everything that was said, and also pretend that these were educational facilities. But now it seems that, and this is especially relevant in this era of fake science, fake news, fake everything, it seems this is something that you cannot ignore, right? This is just delivering proof that they exist.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so all of this work was published on BuzzFeed News, and BuzzFeed is available in China. We also did other things to try and make this information available to people more widely. So we took our entire database of camps and we put it on GitHub, for example, so that people can download it and go and look at all of the locations. I mean, we haven't really heard a lot like from architects in China and the sort of or even other people in China. And I think that's in large part because the internet is so like heavily monitored that it isn't really safe to have those sorts of conversations. And that those conversations would probably have to take place online to a certain extent. And I think that's probably the reason that we haven't really been having them.
Because you said that this is your main occupation, right? Or this occupies most of your time doing this type of research. Could you tell us a little bit how, in retrospect, how from a designing architect you sort of ended up taking the Pulitzer Prize home for reconstructing Chinese camps?
Yeah, sure. So I started working for myself in 2010, and that was the height of the economic crisis, and like nobody was really building, and like young architects definitely weren't building, and so I ended up doing a lot of other things, and I did research projects, and I did some community design and build projects. I did an exhibition. And then in sort of 2015, I started working on a documentary about migration, which was an online documentary, and it used a lot of maps and data to try and tell the stories of these people who were traveling to Europe. Telling the stories of refugees and sort of doing that in real time. And that was my full-time work for 2.5 years, and just in the middle of, and so like my work had already sort of started to shift away from this practice of building, and yet for a long time I was like, well, no, I really want to build and I really want to be designing buildings. It's just that it's the wrong time for whatever reason, but it'll still happen in the future. And I think it was in the middle of working on that migration work that I just started to realize that if I had wanted to be building buildings, that if I had put the same effort into that as I had put into doing all of these other like projects that I had done, many of which took a lot of effort to try and get funding for and sort of find partners and to get off the ground. If I'd put that much effort into trying to build, that I probably would have been building by that point. And I realized that actually I was more interested in other things probably. And other things just felt more urgent. Yeah, so that's how.
Okay. And are you still continuing or planning to continue this research? I guess we had a question from the audience from Geert Buys. I guess that also relates to it. He's asking, is Google continuing to provide updates for these satellite images?
So I'm still working on Xinjiang. At the moment, yeah, we've got a couple more stories planned on Xinjiang. And after that, probably I'll move towards some other things. But yeah, like we're still getting updated images. Google is, I don't know who it is that's commissioning them, who it's commissioning the satellites to sort of take these images. But Google is continuing to acquire new imagery. I think that it's driven by wanting to have up-to-date imagery and to sort of I think that they just would like to have up-to-date imagery of the entire world, and so when there's major change in an area, they will buy new satellite imagery of that area. So yes, they're continuing to update. It's not always updated as fast as we might like. And for that, you know, we've also been using imagery from the European Space Agency, from the Sentinel program, which is also free and public, although it's at lower resolution. But that's available, like, you can get imagery every 2 days of almost the entire world. And then Planet, which is a private, or it's a commercial satellite provider, they also have a media program, and they would often give us access to their imagery. So
do you see it as a possibility that China or other countries, similar countries, might block this access from space? Because it seems like a huge security hole for them right now.
Yeah, I suppose it is. I mean, it is, and that it's. I mean, it's something that we see in conflicts as well. That that access to satellite imagery can really provide a big advantage to one side or the other. You know, I did some workshops a couple of years ago where we looked at Raqqa in Syria, and at the time that was happening, the US had actually bought up all of the satellite imagery of northern Iraq, and it was to prevent their opponents from having, to prevent ISIS from getting access to it, and to, yeah, so that they could know what ISIS were doing, but ISIS couldn't know what US forces were doing.
So, yeah, so in theory, it's possible.
Well, it's about ownership of the satellites, and then it's about jurisdiction over the companies which are taking the images and publishing them. So we're using mostly American, or we're using mostly like US sources, and China just doesn't have the ability to censor those.
Yeah.
Now, another question about censorship, also by Geert Buys. Question is, do you experience any kind of censorship about this topic outside of China? Because also in online conversations seems to be a lot of propaganda, even in Western platforms.
Yeah, we don't see censorship in the sense that we're not seeing articles about Xinjiang being taken down or social media posts about Xinjiang being taken down. That's not what we're seeing. That you do see that in China. But yes, what we see instead is, we see disinformation campaigns instead. And some of that is you know, there are sort of Western actors involved in that who refuse to believe that, think that research on the camps is part of a CIA plot to encourage or to sort of legitimize a war on China, or to legitimize any other sanctions against China. Although I think that's really like the preserve of like the crank left in the West. But we do see sort of propaganda campaigns coming out of China as well, and it'll be things like, I mean, there's a whole series of Western influencers who make YouTube videos and who are based themselves in China, and they'll travel to Xinjiang and then make these videos about how you know, there's nothing going on, there's nothing wrong in Xinjiang, that it's possible to go there and have a wonderful holiday, that they've seen no evidence of forced labor or any camps. So there's that propaganda, and then there's like government propaganda as well, which is actually things like you know, promoting Xinjiang as a tourist destination, and that's been going on for about a year and a half. That they've been really like pushing Xinjiang and especially Kashgar actually as a tourist destination, and it's yeah, and trying to sort of like overcome this story about genocide and replace it with something else.
You could imagine that it could also be part of another propaganda of the US government against China. Does that happen?
What could be?
Well, I could imagine that this story, the proof of these camps, that it could actually be part of the anti-China propaganda by the US. They haven't picked up on that.
I mean, so like just for sort of anyone, for the people watching, just to be very clear, like these camps do exist. It's not, these are not propaganda in that sense. Whether people, whether they're, I mean, there are probably some cranks out there who hate China and then and take a very, very like xenophobic line on this. But there's equally I think like a much larger group of people who see that this is actually just, this is you know, absolutely egregious human rights abuses, and that we should be describing them as such, and you know, and that policymakers in Western countries want to take action to try and stop that, and to also minimize Western countries' complicity in that, for example, through supply chains. Yeah.
Nee, last.
Well, you make it seem, well, you also give workshops explaining this method of work that you do. I could imagine that because this is a new type of research connected to the new digital possibilities, that, yeah, we've also been talking about it, that it actually should be part of the normal curriculum of a studies or of a school like ours. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be really interesting and valuable. I mean, this sort of like digital investigations, I mean, it's increasingly taught in journalism schools because it's become a really key, it's become a really key investigative tool for journalists. Mm-hmm. So these techniques are taught there more and more. But I mean, there's also a lot of techniques which are very closely related to architecture, in which architects and architecture students already have a very like good grounding in, for example, in 3D modeling, that can also be used for these sorts of investigations. And I mean, I definitely think that there would be value in students spending some time like being able to learn those skills at university. Yeah, they're interested too. Yeah.
Now maybe, yeah, the two last questions. The first last is Mike's. How could one contribute to this kind of research?
I mean, so specifically in Xinjiang, I mean, there's a number of groups which are doing research who are looking at, who are like trying to build databases of the people who have been detained. There may be ways to work with them, to volunteer with them, and to help them sort of to build databases. I know that in Rotterdam, there's been a group who've been trying to do a similar thing for Tibet and trying to look at detention through Tibet. So a lot of it has just been these sort of like civil society and activists, and then also sort of journalist groups sort of getting together and starting to investigate a lot of these tools, you know, and starting to investigate a topic that they're interested in. A lot of the tools to do this sort of work they're free and open source. Like, I mean, we did the majority of our work in Google Earth. You can download that program for free, and then you've got this like huge wealth of satellite imagery. And there's also then like communities online to get involved with, you know, like groups like Bellingcat, which do a lot of open source investigation, they work a lot with volunteers. So there's ways to work with them and to start to get involved in real projects. I think Amnesty has started to also work increasingly with volunteer teams. Yeah.
Well, and then the last question, can you already say something about your future plans in this field?
I can't say too much except that I mean I'm still working with Mega and Crystal. And we have a series of future projects sort of lined up. But yeah, I can't really say more about them at the moment.
Okay,
well, that makes us even more curious.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, we'll find out in due time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll keep an eye on you.
Yeah. Good luck with those.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison, for a wonderful presentation and a great talk.
Also on behalf of...
Oh. Cool. No, thank you so much for having me. And
Sure. Speak to you soon.
Yeah. Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.